Hello, Feisty Women's Performance Podcast listeners. It's Sarah Gross here, founder and CEO of Feisty Media. And well, it's kind of been a couple months since we've posted a podcast on this feed, but the wait will be worth it, I promise. First, I hope you all took a moment to listen to the Brainstorm series with Celine Yeager and Rebecca Rush. In particular, if you or a loved one have suffered a concussion. Like everything we do here at Feisty, that series is absolutely packed with great information. It includes experts in the field of concussion research, and Rebecca shares her personal story. So if you haven't listened, check that out. It is right here on the Women's Performance feed. Since it's now January 2025, how did it become 2025? I don't know, but we want to start the year off right. So we're going to be producing a few short series, diving into different topics throughout the first half of the year. And we want to start with one of the most important things that underpins so much for active women: fueling. Feisty is focusing on ditching diet culture once and for all and making sure that every woman knows how to enjoy food and use it to fuel our active lives. So we figured, what better way to do that than partner with Zoe and Kylie from the Your Diet Sucks podcast. On the Your Diet Sucks podcast, journalist, comedian, and ultra runner Zoe Rom teams up with dietitian, nutritionist Kylie Horn to create a show that is funny, relatable, and packed with great advice. Over the next 3 weeks, we will be sharing 3 episodes of the Your Diet Sucks podcast right here on the Women's Performance podcast feed. The first episode will cover a topic I know many of you are interested in: the history and science of fasting. The second episode will dive into why diet culture feels so cult-like these days. From paleo to keto, people believe deeply in that stuff. And the third episode will unpack the evolving conversation around orthorexia, a term that is used to refer to an unhealthy obsession with healthy eating. So if you love these episodes, be sure to subscribe to the Your Diet Sucks podcast feed wherever you listen and follow them on Instagram. And if you want to join the hundreds of women who have learned how to fuel their bodies with us, Feisty's online course, Fueled, will be on sale starting in mid-January. So get yourself on the wait list. The link will be in the show notes.
Welcome to Your Diet Sucks, the podcast that's proud to be dirty.
I'm Kylie Van Horn.
And I'm Zoe Rome. So today we're tackling a big, weird, and exciting topic. So there's more and more information available all the time about what constitutes, quote, good or, quote, healthy eating, especially with the rise of the internet and social media. But there's increasing evidence and conversation about how sometimes that really well-intentioned focus on health can turn really, really unhealthy. And as a journalist, I have been excited to tackle today's topic of orthorexia for a long time because it sits at this really fascinating intersection between changing societal norms, technological advancements, and the very normal human desire for health and wellness.
So, Zoe, let's go back a little bit. Where did the term orthorexia originally come from?
Yeah, so again, something that makes today's topic so interesting is that orthorexia is a fairly recent phenomenon. You'll notice I'm calling it a phenomenon because it's not a clinically recognized diagnosis or mental illness. So the term was actually coined in 1997 in an essay in Yoga Journal, which is a non-scientific journal written by an alternative healthcare practitioner. So I think that even looking at where this term started is important and sort of revelatory of where the term ends up as well. But this word combines the Greek word orth for right, like right as in correct, and orexia for appetite. So it's sort of like a smash up of right appetite. And kind of randomly, the word nervosa was thrown in just for good measure, not because of any real medical taxonomy. Again, this is not a officially recognized medical term. So I wasn't able to track down the full essay, but here's a quote that I did track down. Quote, "People would think they should cut out all dairy and they should cut out all lentils, all wheat. And it dawned on me gradually that many of these patients, their primary problem was that they were far too strict with themselves. And I think that that is really, really interesting because it sort of shows this like key point when practitioners, alternative or otherwise, started to recognize that people in their quest to be healthy became very, very unhealthy. I'd be curious, like, how often do people reach out for you with the desire to quote unquote like get healthier or clean up their diet, and you maybe think that the actual problem is the over obsession with those things?
It's probably around 50% or higher, I would say.
Wow.
I do an application process for when people apply to work one-on-one with me, and it's kind of astounding the number of people that are like, I need to clean up my act, or I need to have more willpower. I need to gain control of my eating habits.
Oh boy.
And then honestly, when I see that, I'm like, whoa, okay, this is going to be a convo, and it's probably going to revolve around somebody over obsessing over food.
Yeah. So another thing that's so interesting is that there's actually a lot of debate in the medical, scientific, amongst dietetics, your people, and mental health practitioners around if this term is useful or not. Should it be recognized or not? There's a really interesting 2014 paper in Psychosomatics where Thomas Dunn, a psychologist at the University of Northern Colorado, argued the case for creating a separate diagnosis for orthorexia, that it should be officially recognized. He proposed criteria for the diagnosis, including symptoms like a fixation on food quality and an intensity of obsession that disrupts people's lives. So this paper proposes that orthorexics fit into roughly the same demographics as people who suffer from anorexia. So I'm going to quote from the paper here. There might be higher rates among men than we see with anorexia, but orthorexics tend to have the same high income levels, high levels of achievement, and similarly obsessive qualities, end quote. So orthorexics can also become underweight as a result of restricting their diets, although orthorexia, like many other mental health diagnoses, can coexist with anorexia in the same way that anxiety can accompany depression. There are important distinctions between the two conditions. Orthorexia really stems from this focus of obsession of like quality of food, purity of food, and some things that we'll get into later, whereas anorexia more stems from issues of control, weight control, and management in those worlds. So there is a lot of debate around how useful this term is. Orthorexia entered the public consciousness alongside a number of other trendy and really casually bandied about terms for disordered eating, largely invented by the media, which has a troubled history with these diagnoses, such as drunkorexia, manorexia, bigorexia, and I'm trying so hard not to just shriek through all of these terms. But some experts say that orthorexia, like those bullshit made up terms, trivialize true illnesses like anorexia or bulimia. Some even argued that the term orthorexia can be attributed to a pop psychology culture that's quick to pathologize every quirk or poor decision as a disease.
And I think this is what makes it so difficult, right? Because a lot of people that I work with, they're like, but I don't have a problem. And it's really hard to get into with them that like, okay, this is tipping into more of a control and a potentially like something that they would diagnose as an eating disorder. And so I think, from my perspective, I think orthorexia is something that should be more recognizable or a possible diagnosis for someone because of the severity of symptoms that I see from people just on a regular basis that aren't taking it seriously.
I would agree with that because, like you said, it can really seriously disrupt people's lives, and having an official diagnosis and having a clinical understanding, would help more people realize that they have a potential issue and would equip more people to seek treatment. As we discussed in our eating disorder episode, so many people who are diagnosed with EDs aren't able to receive treatment. And if what you have is orthorexia and it's not officially recognized as a problem, you're not going to be able to get treatment. So I am in favor of it being recognized.
Zoe, so when did this term or idea really take off?
Interestingly, I pulled up the Google Trends for this, and you can see in the past 5 years, Google searches for the term clean eating tend to spike every January 1st, which is pretty predictable. But what I thought was actually really interesting is there was sort of like a mesa, like they spiked overall searches, really trended upwards during the pandemic and reached a crescendo in late 2020, early 2021. And I think that's really telling because, again, oftentimes when people feel concerned about their health or disconnected from medical systems, they will often individuate those circumstances by striving to, like you said, clean up their act or demonstrate, quote unquote, more willpower in their lives. And the most common word searched with clean eating was thin. And I think that's really important because it shows that ultimately the end game for quote unquote clean eating is still the pursuit of thinness. Other words that were often searched with clean eating were the word choice and contamination, which again, I think is really revealing because it shows how often people individuate these things. And the word contamination nods to a point that we'll address, that these things are often associated with a morality or a judgment around food. And this has really been fueled by the rise of celebrity diet gurus and glamorous food photos on social media that reinforce the idea that eating only certain foods and avoiding others is virtuous and practically a religion. See our cult episode for more on that. So, orthorexia is not officially recognized by the DSM. There is no official clinical definition or diagnosis. But according to experts, the consensus is this becomes a problem when your fixation on food and healthy or clean eating begins to infringe on your quality of life or your ability to be spontaneous, connected, or just engaged in the world around you. Again, there is no official definition or diagnosis or even consensus on what orthorexia is. Interestingly, there are actually only 145 published papers on orthorexia, but there's over 16,000 on anorexia nervosa and over 40,000 on EDs in general. So the knowledge base is really limited, and I would love to see more research done here.
In practice, if I'm trying to bring this up to people, it's hard for them to see that, oh, maybe I do have a problem with this, or they don't know what orthorexia is. So I'm not necessarily like using that term in conversation with people, but I'll bring up things in convo saying, hey, like, have you thought about the possibility that you're hyper-focused on the cleanliness of your food or the processed foods or additives and that sort of thing? And it takes a little while for people sometimes to have that light bulb to go off in their head too, because they don't make that connection.
Do you use this term in practice at all with clients or even with colleagues in endurance sports, nutrition, and dietetics?
Just being honest here, I had thought that it was an official diagnosis because I've had some clients come to me that said that they were orthorexic, and whether that was given to them as a possible, like, I don't know if it was confused with a diagnosis or not, could be a possibility, but they came to me saying, you know, I have orthorexic tendencies or I've been diagnosed with orthorexia. And so I will have that conversation with them in, you know, our work together. But if I'm working with someone and I suspect that there's this overemphasis on clean eating, the healthiness of foods, et cetera, I'll talk to the person in those terms because I think it's more relatable and understandable.
Yeah, I definitely see the utility in like having that term of like, I have orthorexic tendencies. When you're able to sort of put a name to something, potentially it could really encourage people to seek treatment and seek healing in that. But there was actually a 2018 review of orthorexia studies published in the journal Eating and Weight Disorders that found no common definition, no standard diagnostic criteria, or any reliable way to measure orthorexia's psychological impact. But what it did find is that, quote unquote, orthorexia, orthorexic tendencies, or orthorexic behaviors are often driven by our culture's fixation on thinness. It's also driven by, I think, a sort of reactionary impulse to push back against what we all know is a pretty fucked up food system with an unhealthy focus on eating purely or cleanly.
I see the pursuit of thinness as one of the most common reasons why people pursue the clean eating lifestyle or this overfixation.
Like, you have to be thin, but not too thin. And you can never say you want to be thin. You have to say you want to be healthy, but also you have to be thin.
And it's something where sometimes I have to get to the root of the person's desires I have to ask the right questions to see what they're actually trying to achieve. And I'll say, so where do you think this desire is coming from? And it takes them a little while, and we eventually get to the idea of, oh, it's an aesthetic thing, or it's a weight loss thing. And, then that is, again, another light bulb moment, and we have to have those conversations.
I think so often the language of orthorexia and the language of clean eating disguises or like sort of launders eating disorder and disordered eating tendencies. And wellness culture does it too. It sort of distorts people's true motivations. People will say, I want to be healthy, I want to eat clean. But oftentimes, like you said, what they want is to embody a certain aesthetic ideal that we've decided as a culture is superior or is healthy, despite the preponderance of evidence that suggests otherwise.
Well, and then it gets to a point of like extreme anxiety, like you can't even live your life without thinking about, is this thing going to kill me? Is this going to make me more unhealthy? Am I going to die earlier because I ate some red dye in a piece of candy?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I remember when I worked outside for a while, we owned Clean Eating. The euphemism we learned as we sunset that particular brand. But I remember once the front page article on clean eating was your couch is probably killing you. And it was about some like obscure quote unquote toxic thing that was in like some like fabric protectant. And it was just like very clearly it's part of that larger culture of like everything's trying to kill you. Everything is toxic. Toxins are all around you. And like, yeah, there's definitely some stuff in our world that we encounter every day that isn't super healthy for us. But the like just overt pseudoscientific fear mongering about like every ingredient is trying to kill you and therefore you must be hyper vigilant about everything that your body comes in contact with is really, really unhealthy, right? And I think it shows that so often our concept of health doesn't include the idea of mental health as well. Because I would say if you're scared of your couch, you are fucking mentally unwell.
Oh my God.
And if you aren't able to hang out and have a meal with your friends, your social wellness isn't being accounted for either.
If 2024 taught us anything, it was that a fueled athlete will get the best out of her body every time. From record-setting performances to learning to embrace strong, powerful bodies, the best athletes were the ones who nailed their nutrition on a daily basis. But good fueling isn't just for elite athletes. It's maybe even more important for busy women like you who are balancing all the stresses of life. Good fueling is the way you maximize all that hard work you're putting into your training. And it's how you have the energy to focus at work, to be present with your family, to meet your goals, to do all the things that you want to do this year. And that's why we're kicking off 2025 with our popular Feisty Fueled course. We created this course for active women who want to go deep into all the things that impact the ways we fuel our body, like the narratives living rent-free in our head around food, understanding how our body uses food to power our training in our lives, understanding how those hormones impact nutrition, and how to recognize underfueling and what you can do about it. And then we top it all off by giving you the tools you need to create a nutrition plan that works for your goals and for your lifestyle. It's not about following a diet. It's about understanding what you need to live your strongest, healthiest, and most feisty life this year. Enrollment for this course is open from January 10th through 22nd, and will kick off our community the week of January 27th. To learn more or sign up, head over to womensperformance.com/fueled or check out the link in the show notes.
I feel like we see this more often in endurance athletes, especially runners.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you see it in practice, and what you said earlier is revealed in the research. So there was a 2023 study in the Journal of Eating Disorders that showed that, quote, populations that exercise have a 55% prevalence. And although the study didn't find a correlation between activity and prevalence, it did point out actually in the methodology section that their demographic information wasn't high quality and likely needed more study. They weren't able to say exactly what sports put you at a higher predisposition to orthorexia. There was another study that showed that endurance athletes and runners especially have higher symptom severity when it comes to orthorexia, according to a 2023 study in the journal Eating and Weight Disorders Studies on Anorexia, Bulimia, and Obesity. And that study actually showed a positive linear relationship between compulsive exercise habits and both orthorexia and disordered eating, which I feel like is pretty intuitive to us. A lot of these things are comorbid with each other. Exercise dependence, eating disorder risk factors, a lot of those things are sort of like they're the handshake emoji meeting in the middle. Orthorexia was negatively associated with adaptive eating motivations like hunger and pleasure, and was positively associated with terms like weight control, again, indicating that a lot of the times this is rooted in the desire to manipulate weight and body shape and body presentation, and that that's a strong motivator for food choices in those who present with orthorexia. And I feel like where this gets so interesting when it comes to athletes, the sticky situation is sports nutrition. And I'd be so curious to hear what you see in practice, because personally, we just see it so much with people trying to avoid quote unquote processed sports nutrition and feeling that opting for quote whole or quote real foods, as if there are fake or unwhole foods, is better while exercising. Again, no one here is saying that you should only eat processed foods all the time or that you should pay no attention to your food. But I think that it could be really harmful if athletes, particularly endurance athletes like me, I like to run 100 miles. That's my shit. I don't know why. I was held plenty as a baby. There's really no root cause for it. But if I tried to fuel my ultras only using quote unquote whole or real foods, I would not be able to do it.
Well, and I'm just like, I always laugh at this because I'm like, what is the point here? Why are we demonizing? It's sugar, usually.
Yes.
Demonizing sugar.
Sugar! Fuck yeah!
Because in my mind, I want sugar to give me the energy that I need when I'm exercising. I personally like to push my limits. And if I'm not getting carbohydrates and sugar in, I feel like I'm not fully able to push myself.
Yeah. Is this something you see a lot with your clients, the avoidance of processed foods, not just like in daily life, but literally during exercise?
Oh, yeah. This is one of the biggest challenges.
What does that
I feel
look
like I feel like I face as a dietitian. And I think one of the reasons why is if we look at some of these sports nutrition companies and the language and the marketing that they're using, which we're going to need to do a whole episode on that.
But we have a whole episode on this planned. Fertile ground.
It is, because I swear, like, every week I will have people sending me emails that certain companies sent out to them, or a social media post about something being likened to Ozempic.
This is straight up, UCAN had an advertisement that said it was Ozempic for athletes. I'm going to throw them under the bus because that shit is fucked.
Yeah, definitely. And
also, that's not how anything works.
Exactly. So I just think this obsession with, not having a processed food or not having sugar, it gets in the way of performance goals.
Yeah.
And
I think it's, again, telling that these companies who have data, they're not stupid, right? Like, these people have PhDs in nutrition. They have PhDs or master's degrees, advanced degrees in marketing and communications. And they realize that it can be more effective to market using pseudoscience and fear mongering. That can be more effective than actually marketing and saying this will help you perform better.
And what I usually say too is like, okay, great. Like, if you want to use food to fuel or food blends or any of these, if you like, you can, great. But also the problem is I find that a lot of people then that use these products are then demonizing other products or demonizing or judging others for using other types of products, which is where the problem comes in.
Yeah. I also, like, one of my media pet peeves is like feigning surprise when an elite athlete, like, did you know Courtney Dauwalter eats cheeseburgers? It's like, yeah, no shit. She runs a ton. She needs calories. And it's like supposed to surprise us or mind blow us that someone who's purported to be healthy and presents as an athlete might deign to eat a food that the normal people eat.
Well, and if we look at it from we know that endurance athletes are more susceptible to things like eating disorders, disordered eating. And it's like they're marketing to this population and potentially making this problem worse or making the risk higher.
Not potentially making this problem worse, measurably in the research, making this problem worse.
Yeah,
See our references page.
Exactly. So thinking about the consequences of this as well, I have people that repeated history of stress fractures, and they're worried about what they're fueling with during exercise, and maybe they should consume less calories during exercise because they don't want to consume sugary gels. That's a problem. Like you are hurting yourself more by not fueling yourself because you are worried about sugar that you're going to use right away for energy production.
Or Element. Again, like they have a lot of advertisement that calls it clean, sugar-free energy. And it's an electrolyte product. It is not a carbohydrate product. Electrolytes do not give you energy. They are important for your metabolism and for digestion, but they are not a source of energy. Sugar can be a source of energy.
Sugar! Fuck yeah!
Again, I'm not saying go eat a mound of sugar, snort a line of sugar, and only eat gummy bears for the rest of your life. But this like conflation of like sugar as being bad and dirty and not clean. And then again, just purporting that other random micronutrients are cleaner because they're not sugar is not based in reality. It is not based in science.
Yeah. And I think, for people that are going to criticize us for talking about sugar, I like to explain.
For people that want to criticize us, make sure that you attach a page of references to any of your feedback or comments.
I do like to point out to athletes, though, that as an endurance athlete, a lot of people are, your carbohydrate needs are so high. I was just having a conversation with an athlete today on this exact topic. N of 1. About he needed 600 grams of carbs plus per day to support his training level. And this is legit. Like this person has a history of bone stress injuries. He has a lower bone density. And when you're not eating enough carbohydrates, that makes you at risk for higher risk of decreased bone density. So he had asked about, should I be switching some of my Cliff Bars or some of my carbohydrate containing products to something that's cleaner? And I was like, no, you need to get in the carbohydrates. That's your main focus here.
Yes.
And if somebody else that doesn't exercise is talking to you about this and trying to get you to not eat those things, explain to them that you're a different case scenario. And if you're not exercising, maybe you don't need as much carbohydrate and you can choose what kinds of carbs you want to eat. But again, don't demonize these sources of carbohydrate that are really convenient for athletes and are needed.
Yeah, beyond the scope of this specific discussion, they're outside of the world of athletics in general. There are, I think, some important discussions around diet and healthy eating occurring. I think a lot of them lack nuance and robust scientific evidence. But I think sometimes when those things get additionally filtered in our world of like fitness and athletics, people pick up on these like distorted diet culture messages and start to internalize them when it is most important that they react against them.
Exactly. So while the term orthorexia isn't officially recognized and isn't really used by lay people, the term clean eating is. And its loose definition and lack of scientific support are very problematic.
Yeah. I mean, how often do you hear the term clean eating in your work?
Oh, it's all the time.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, oh, what is clean eating? Can you please explain that to me?
So, yeah, I think that's exactly why it's a problem. There isn't a definition, right? It's really intentionally vague. But some definitions typically include elements like eating local. I'm using a lot, like my fingers are going to get blown the fuck up because of how many air quotes I'm doing. Eating local, eating real, non-processed, organic, plant-based, home-cooked foods. But they also tout some extreme strategies like eliminating gluten, grains, dairy. And given the absence of a clear definition and strategies to assess clean eating, it's unclear why people really pursue these types of diets. Unclear in the research. I think it's clear to us somewhat on an intuitive level, but the research has sort of struggled to consistently quantify why people opt for these diets. So there, in the research, points to likely motivations for pursuing clean eating that range from general health or well-being to weight loss, curing diseases, and proponents of clean eating often make these really far-fetched claims about its purported benefits. The media frequently shares like these bananas anecdotes, like so-and-so juiced 6 times per day and then was cancer-free in 3 months, or athlete testimony claiming that whatever clean supplement helps them reach that PR, get on that podium. And they'll note, again, like this really ambiguous cloud of purported benefits like radiant skin, weight loss, reduced brain fog, reduced cholesterol, eliminating diabetes, and eliminating migraines. And although some do caution against taking clean eating to a point of fearing foods, the widespread promotion and ambiguity regarding the nature of clean eating, I think, highlights the need for further investigation and more nuanced discussion.
Yeah, and then the dangerous side of this that we've kind of been talking about a little bit, if somebody is juicing 6 times per day and talking about becoming cancer-free in 3 months, that is just pure negligence, and it's really dangerous for people to be following that kind of information.
Yeah. But again, like social media, the algorithms promote and incentivize that type of bananas extreme messaging.
Let's talk a little bit about what healthy eating versus an unhealthy fixation on healthy eating can look like, Zoe.
Yeah, so I think something that would be like a healthy version of this could be you do your best to make nutritious food choices most of the time, but you're flexible when you need to be. You go out to dinner with friends, you have a piece of pizza, it doesn't rock your world. The unhealthy version would be you stick rigidly to your diet and you might even refuse to eat or become anxious if you don't have access to foods that meet your specifications.
This is all too common with people that I work with, and the problem also can come in where someone is so inflexible that, like on the daily, all the time, that then it leads to binge episodes too.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. So a healthy point of view could be you cut out certain foods for general health reasons or because you physically feel better when you avoid them. Not everyone needs to eat everything all the time, and that's okay. There are some very valid reasons to avoid certain foods or food groups for many people. The unhealthy version, though, is you cut out certain foods or even entire food groups because you view them as, quote, bad or impure.
Yeah, and I want to point out to people, sometimes with my athletes that are in eating disorder recovery, they have a hard time delineating between, is this food actually making me feel physically bad, or is it my eating disorder saying that this food is making me feel physically bad? So you have to be honest and in tune with yourself when you're kind of trying to decide whether something is healthy versus unhealthy, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And it so much is about like checking in with yourself. And that is so hard, like especially when an eating disorder, disordered eating can like skew your perception of these things. Like a big part of my recovery was N of 1. Essentially like avocado exposure therapy. Avocados were a thing for me. I really they freaked me out. That was like a big fear I had. So I had to do a ton, and again, no standard of care, would be really interested to see how much scientific research supports this methodology. But in recovery, I ate a lot of avocados to try to get back in tune with do I like this food? How does it make me feel outside of the narrative that I had grafted onto that food, which the ED narrative I had grafted onto it was it's too high in fat and it's unhealthy.
Well, and this is, as a practitioner, this is actually a challenging thing to engage in with athletes in eating disorder recovery, because sometimes I think the model is, well, you have to introduce all of these foods that you have a fear around and you have to like them. And so it's I've had athletes that are but I really don't like donuts and how they make me feel.
Yeah,
and then it's hard to kind of delineate between, do I actually not want this food to be included, or is it, again, the eating disorder talking?
Yeah, totally. And that's why, again, more research and standard of care needed, but it so much comes back to getting in tune with what you feel, what feels good for you. And again, that's why we're not promoting go out and only eat donuts all the time. That's probably not going to make you feel that awesome. But if you're never going out and never eating a donut for reasons that have nothing to do with how you feel that becomes problematic. So again, healthy could be your identity is based on various interests, friends, work, and hobbies. Unhealthy, your identity is based largely on the purity and perfection of your diet. See again, our cult episode. So, I think I'd be really curious to hear what's a specific thing that you've seen in practice when it comes to how orthorexia can impact endurance athletes.
Like I said, the most common thing that I see is the no sugar. That could be during and outside of exercise too.
I feel like sugar is a big one, and also the really fucked up conversations around quote unquote being addicted to sugar.
Yeah, sugar addiction, I would say, yes. And sugar and inflammation, which I think is really difficult.
That's on my clean eating bingo card.
Okay. Yeah. So with inflammation too, it's a term that needs to be discussed more in depth. You can't just say, oh, don't eat sugar and you're going to reduce your inflammation. It's more complex than that. And I think that's where part of, not to get too off topic here, but when we see things in social media, cut down on sugar and reduce your inflammation, it's like, well, people need more context than that. Like, why are we touting this as like a crazy extreme?
Yeah. And so again, like without a formal diagnostic criteria, it's really challenging to determine exactly how many people struggle with this. So while we sort of have some ideas about prevalence in certain groups, we don't know how many people have this thing that people haven't even fully decided if it's a thing you can have. But prevalence, again, in the research varies across countries and populations. Fascinatingly, about 6.9% of the Italian population in one study demonstrated orthorexic tendencies and behaviors, whereas 88.7% of those surveyed in Brazil did, per a 2021 review in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. So no formal diagnosis, no clinical definition, but there are a common cluster of symptoms. So those include things like social isolation, avoiding meals, agonizing over food choices, insisting on preparing meals oneself, adhering rigidly to dietary rules, cutting out whole food groups regardless of health and allergies or medically necessary or religiously mandated restrictions. Research has also shown that individuals with low self-esteem or body dissatisfaction seek a sense of identity and self-worth by pursuing an idealized, quote-unquote, healthy lifestyle and using food choices to gain a sense of accomplishment and validation.
I kind of want to just interject quickly here and also point out coaches and medical professionals can actually play a role in the proliferation of orthorexia, and they might not know that they're doing that, but
right. How do you see that happening?
Well, I have some athletes, they might go to the doctor and have elevated A1C, like which is your blood sugar over the past 3 months. And a doctor might say, oh, you need to cut out carbs or go keto. And it's just like these blanket statements to people that are really unhelpful. Or a coach might be promoting, oh, hey, if you just lost those 10 pounds, you could be a lot faster and achieve your goals. And even a comment like that can throw someone into, oh, I need to be more diligent or strict with what I'm eating. And so it just brings up the point of being careful as professionals and how we talk to athletes about these certain topics.
Yeah, or any kind of authority figure. I would even say the athlete influencer who is positioning themselves as if they are an authority on nutrition and diet. But similar to other EDs, the cornerstone of orthorexia really is the need to be or feel in control. So risk factors include tendencies towards obsessive compulsion, perfectionism, neuroticism, and sometimes a fear of sickness or injury. What makes orthorexia sort of like different, but it like borrows from the world of hypochondria, which is a worry about an undiagnosed illness. The anxiety in orthorexia comes from the fear of developing poor health in the future, which is definitely a thing we see in athletic populations a lot, which like it's almost more like people will be more afraid of what will eating sugar cause me to develop inflammation, and they're less, which is like poorly understood, poorly not seen in a ton of research in ways that I think that we should be making day-to-day decisions based off of in terms of like in-run fueling. But they'll focus on that to the detriment of like, there is a ton of research that shows when you cut things out and when you underfuel, it dramatically increases your risk of stress injury.
Yeah. And I'd be curious, I don't know if they've done studies about this, but the age category where this might occur, because actually, like in a younger population, sometimes fear mongering doesn't really do any, like it doesn't work. Like 30 years from now, you're going to get a bone stress injury. Like that just doesn't connect for people. But sometimes when I'm chatting with people in their 30s or 40s, they're like, oh, I might get cancer if I eat this processed food, and I might get it in 10 years. Like it seems to me to be more prevalent and as we get older, but I don't know if that's
actually
true or not.
what so the demographic data is kind of all over the place, but what I found really interesting about sort of like the themes across many populations, it's actually fairly consistent. So relative to other eating disorders, it's actually more evenly split across both gender and age groups.
Wow, that's interesting.
There are other sort of like, depending on what specific in-groups you belong to, like social media users, athletes, there are other risk factors. But, and again, like there are other eating disorders that we've talked about on other episodes tend to present very differently across populations. Caveat that, again, this is something that merits further study and drilling in deeper in terms of like how this presents in different populations. It's much more evenly split in men and women. It's much more evenly split in age demographic groups. I'm talking about the US in terms of the data I'm referencing here. But as we saw earlier, it's actually globally really wildly skewed in different countries. And I think, again, that shows that different cultures have different relationships to food and different relationships to health. And this particular eating disorder is really, really grounded in a cultural understanding of food and health. And another thing that it's really tied to is underlying anxiety or fear of adverse health consequences that drives individuals to adopt these increasingly restrictive diets to presumably protect their well-being, inadvertently exacerbating obsessive behaviors. So there's actually some research that shows that even following special diets like being vegetarian, pescatarian, vegan, raw, paleo, keto, gluten-free is linked with higher rates of eating disorders, and results from another fascinating systemic overview suggested that following a therapeutic diet due to chronic illness like diabetes or celiac disease also increases ED risk. So it's sort of like as soon as you become really focused on the connection between diet and health, and those things are related and there are very important things to understand about that, but anytime you become hyper fixated on that, it dramatically increases your risks for developing these counterproductive orthorexic behaviors.
Yeah, and being aware that, you know, if you have a history of an eating disorder, that gravitating towards any of these therapeutic diets or maybe a plant-based lifestyle.
Or I think, you know, with therapeutic, it's more like that's a really important conversation to have with your healthcare provider.
So I think, you know, if you have a history of an eating disorder, just being more aware that like if you are put on a therapeutic diet or you decide you're going to go plant-based, reasoning for why you're doing that and being aware that those sorts of things could perpetually like exacerbate an eating disorder. And some of my athletes that I've worked with have gravitated towards those things, and then they don't recognize, oh, shoot, like I'm still kind of in this place and I'm using this as a form of control. Nothing against therapeutic diets. I use them with my clients. They're very real. They can be very helpful. But if you are doing one of those, please get help and guidance on how to best do those as an endurance athlete.
Exactly. Nailed it.
So I see orthorexia, clean eating, whatever we want to use as the term. I see this a lot in people who think they actually know a lot about nutrition.
Yeah, I'd actually be really interested as a professional registered dietitian nutritionist. What does this look like in sort of like the professional echelons of these conversations?
I'll be honest, just from experience, you know, I've had a lot of colleagues that have an eating disorder history. I have colleagues that I suspect are still struggling with their own challenges with their eating habits and maybe tend to hyper focus on the cleanliness of food or healthifying foods as part of their practice.
Cauliflower.
As part of their practice, which might not be the greatest. I guess I don't blame people for maybe getting into the profession and having that interest in food. There just has to be maybe a delineation between like, am I projecting some things that I have internalized on my clients? How am I talking to people and helping them with food when I might have had that history? Or have issues that I haven't confronted yet.
Yeah, I mean, that really resonates with me. Again, like as a food journalist with a eating disorder history, I would categorize myself as someone who has always been interested in food. Historically, that interest hasn't always been healthy, but now I've been able to primarily transmute it into a more healthy and productive interest in food, but that it does really cause me to approach this work with a lot more humility, I think. And again, this is borne out in the research because there has actually been an uptick in the prevalence of ideals around clean eating in our culture. And there's even some research that shows that people who grew up in contexts where adults around them were very harsh and judgmental about processed foods or overly rigid around specific ingredients, and even grew up around habits like being always soy, sugar, dairy-free without a medical reason, or obsessive ingredient checking can actually sometimes escalate into an obsession later on in adulthood.
Yeah, I see that. I see that all the time, unfortunately. And I get whenever I am working with someone that has challenges with food, I'll ask their story, their history of, growing up and what that relationship to food looked like when they were growing up, because that's really important context when you're trying to work through some of these challenges.
Yeah. And, there was actually, fascinatingly, a pilot study published in 2020 showed that 72% of nutrition students studied, which was 500 students from 6 different universities, of those people, 72% presented as having orthorexic behaviors.
And I just want to add, though, I feel like that, and I don't want to talk crap about our Academy of Nutrition, but also I don't agree with some of the things that they promote. And they're very weight focused and very focused on not having processed foods and cleanliness of things. And I feel like that does our profession a little bit of a disservice, which is actually one of the reasons why I wanted to become a dietitian, is because I wanted to help promote change from the inside rather than being an outsider.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's such an important point to make, is that where you can critique a system without necessarily wanting to burn it down or do away with it or like purely function outside of it. I think that, again, like your profession flawed, but important. Similarly, medical systems flawed, but important. Don't think we need to totally burn them down, but would love to see more nuanced understanding and conversation around these really, really important topics. So I think that like another thing that's really driving it isn't just information, but a lot of misinformation about foods that sort of permeate and circulate on the internet. Like the one that always gets me is detoxing, which is ideally something your kidneys and liver should do. But another theme that we see so much is this moralization around food and demonizing specific ingredients. Like you said, with athletes who demonize sugar.
I would say, this focus in maybe holistic health and the holistic athlete. I see it a lot in that realm too. And there's a lot of nutrition certifications out there that people can get that I do think can contribute to the misinformation and the demonizing of specific ingredients, et cetera. And then it makes people scared of food.
Yeah. And like, again, like how can your quote unquote holistic understanding of an athlete or a person not include their mental health, not include their risk factors for eating disorders and mental illness, not include their social health?
Well, and it is like, I do think it's also a misunderstanding of eating disorders too.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people that don't understand them. They fail to even think that they're a thing and then ask people about their history.
Or understand how prevalent they are.
Exactly.
And again, likely if you're working with people in nutrition coaching, you're working with a population that's at pretty high risk for those things.
Exactly.
A study in Frontiers in Nutrition called Sinful Foods, measuring implicit associations between food categories and moral attributes in anorexic, orthorexic, and healthy subjects, demonstrated that people who ascribe moral judgment to food were way more likely to have eating disorders than those with more neutral feelings towards foods. So the authors explicitly asked eating disorder patients who fall into the category of either restrictive anorexic, binge purge anorexic, and bulimic, and control subjects to categorize 27 different food names. And the results showed that restrictive anorexic patients relied more on moral criteria like deontic terms such as obligation and permission, like I can or I can't eat this, to form food categories versus other patients. So this observation actually really interestingly, going back to our fasting episode, echoed religious aestheticism that is historically deeply connected to what is sometimes called holy anorexia, illustrated by the case of like Catherine of Siena, or food deprivation that monks and clerics voluntarily endured in early Catholicism, anchored in aesthetic practices defined at the end of antiquity. And the study also actually analyzed language that was used in Western food advertising language that points out that language like purity, heaven, decadence, temptation, sinful, as being suspected to contribute to eating disorder behaviors linked to moral perceptions of specific foods. So I think that is so telling, that how we talk about food really influences how we experience it and can actually directly influence our predisposition to eating disorders. So like as a registered dietitian nutritionist, what terms would you want to hear athletes throw out the window?
So the clean eating.
The word clean, unless it is like physically dirty.
Yeah. Clean eating, cheat meals.
Cheating. Eating is never cheating.
Unnatural.
Raw, pure,
primal,
clean, primal. Yeah. Natural, all natural. Yeah, I think another thing that's really interesting about this study is that it actually points out that the same cognitive system that was originally anchored in how our brain would categorize food as like rotten and bad to eat, or okay to eat, this is safe, this isn't rotten, it's not spoiled, that actually sort of crossed wires with the part of our brain that assesses good, bad. So essentially that explains why some attributes might occur both in the food and the moral domain, like lightness, purity, clean, dirty, good, bad. But I think that becomes so problematic when the part of our brain that assesses good and evil starts to dictate what we like can or can't pick up at the salad bar.
I feel like orthorexia and this over obsession with clean eating has been on the rise with the introduction of social media and the influence of technology.
Yeah, that's not just a feeling. It's actually borne out in the research. So media portrayals of unrealistic and often digitally enhanced body images can further reinforce and police these societal norms that perpetuate a narrow, unattainable, and just unrealistic standard of quote unquote beauty. So as a result, individuals, particularly adolescents and young adults, might internalize those ideals and engage in extreme dieting or disordered eating behaviors to conform to those perceived expectations. Social media platforms, in particular, have become powerful conduits for disseminating dietary trends and promoting a clean eating culture. So something that is shown in the research as, again, really furthering these really problematic trends is that constant exposure to curated images of seemingly perfect bodies and healthy eating habits can create an environment that actually normalizes eating disorders, disordered eating, and extreme diets, and it reinforces that adhering to these strict dietary rules is the key to achieving health and success, right? Like I think so much of the meal prepping or so much of health and fitness culture, things that are promoted to us as being healthy and normal, are actually not very healthy and could actually be pretty bad behaviors.
I usually like to, when I'm working with athletes, I'll even ask about social media behaviors, and I'll have people go through sometimes and do an audit of their own social media accounts to look for, you know, do you have diversity in bodies that of the accounts you're following?
Yeah.
And then are the people that you're following, does what they're promoting, is that helpful to you or harmful? And analyzing those things, especially with the accounts that people tend to interact with. And I've found that recovery process can be impeded when people are following the wrong accounts as well.
And it could have started with like a pretty innocent or normal desire to like get some recipes. Like I noticed in my own, like I would watch an influencer prepare like a fancy looking jar salad. And because the algorithm could tell that I lingered on those videos, it started serving me like, oh, if you like salads, then you'll like these pictures of salads. And eventually it escalated into some pretty, for me, triggering content. And that's not just personal experience. The Facebook whistleblower that came out a few years ago, internal Facebook audit showed that fake accounts that were supposed to sort of be avatars for 13-year-old girls, they started liking health and fitness content, and within just days, they were being served pro-Anna content. So the algorithm is really incentivized to promote this really harmful material. So there was actually one study that found that among the study population, 49% of Instagram users that were surveyed demonstrated orthorexic behaviors versus just 1% of the general population. And I think Instagram is pretty uniquely culpable because it's a visual, algorithmically driven social media platform, and no other social media channel had a comparable effect. Caveat that this study is a couple years old and TikTok hadn't been studied. And I would guess that TikTok, because of also its very aggressive and very addictive algorithm, probably really hastens this stuff as well.
Oh, yeah. I would agree with that.
Are you on TikTok?
I am not on TikTok. Although my sister said that I need to get on because I'm not with the times if I'm not on TikTok.
I'm afraid of it because of how aggressive the algorithm is and how like addictive it can be. And again, like this visual content can really shape how we perceive the world. We start to only see bodies that look a certain way, and our brains will literally start to think that that is how a human body should look, or that certain people eat a certain way. We start to think that that is how we should eat. Like I'm so sick of seeing the dumb Instagram smoothie bowls with like the perfectly fanned out strawberries and the perfect little sprinkle of coconut flakes and like the girl with the perfect manicure and the just like totally bananas tan eating it in a sports bra on her patio in Hawaii.
I used to have a co-dietitian, and we liked to make posts on our Instagram stories about our imperfect plates, which was amazing.
Yes. Yeah. And I think, again, like a lot of this can start with actually pretty like healthy impulses to like get recipes or to get workout tips. But there was a German study published in 2023 that found that people who follow health and fitness accounts were significantly more likely to exhibit orthorexic eating tendencies. And I think, again, a lot of the habits that are being promoted by influencers or even athletes might actually be sort of grounded in disordered eating.
Yeah, and I think another big cause here is how our culture around food is changing. Lots of people are trying to learn more about where their food comes from, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, or they're just trying to be a little bit healthier, but then sometimes it gets out of control.
Yeah, exactly. I think that, again, like our food system is very, very flawed. Our healthcare system is very, very flawed. And a lot of people try to wrest control back in some ways that are pretty healthy and in some ways that are unhealthy. Our modern culture really emphasizes this idea that appearance is king, and it absolutely equates health and beauty with thinness as a particular body ideal. And as we've discussed, dietary rules can provide a much needed sense of identity and purpose, or a way of just defining ourselves as part of a health conscious community. But the problem becomes when we glorify certain dietary practices and demonize others in media and popular culture, which fosters this all or nothing approach to food consumption, and it can reinforce the belief that only pure and healthy foods are acceptable. So there's so many societal pressures to conform to these standards in fear of being judged or ostracized or deviating that then might escalate into orthorexic behaviors and tendencies. I'm sure this is something that as a registered dietitian nutritionist, you experience. Like people might be afraid that you might judge them because they have a misconception about your beliefs and what the scientific consensus is on things.
Well, it kind of goes both ways, actually, because I've talked with colleagues, and I think I mentioned this on another episode about how we can feel judged as dietitians too.
Yeah.
People will make comments like, "Oh, you're going to eat that cake because I'm a dietitian. I'm not allowed to eat cake," or something.
Did you? Was that part of your training? Did you have to like pass a test and then swear to never eat dessert again?
I don't know with the academy. I'm not going to comment. But
I'm here to confirm that she does eat cake.
I eat cake. Also, I do feel badly for athletes that feel the need to think that they're going to be judged by a health professional, including myself or anyone else that they're working with, because I'll go into sessions and I'll even wonder, is this person able to be open with me? And sometimes it takes a while to gain that rapport with someone for them to open up and realize that I'm not judging you. Or I've even had friends that are self-conscious around me when they're maybe getting candy at a gas station or a diet soda or something. I don't judge people for their food choices, and I kind of expect the same from others, for myself, because I'll feel that pressure. If I get a Diet Coke, like, I don't want anyone judging me.
Yeah. Oh man, I do feel that. And I do not judge people for their food choices, but I do appreciate that you are always excited to split a basket of fries with me. That is everything I want from a female friendship. But, there are these certain in-groups that we create that actually can exacerbate orthorexic tendencies. Research shows that parents, because of fear or perceived fear of judgment from other parents, it can exacerbate orthorexic tendencies even in just how they feed their kids. They can get hyper-focused on organic foods, pure foods, because they're really nervous and concerned about how other parents will perceive them. And the same thing, again, is studied in athletes. Athletes, when they're eating around each other or talking with each other or performing their athletic identities on social media, will overperform the healthyism part of it and will inadvertently exacerbate these problems within their own communities. I'm curious, like, as someone that works with a lot of clients trying to overcome this, what are the harms that you see this causes in people's lives besides not being able to get Diet Coke at a gas station?
Yeah, I mean, the social impact, I think we talked about that a little bit. It can make it really hard to connect with people because food is connection. And so going out to eat, going over to a friend's house, you might avoid those situations. I've seen it completely consume people's mental thought processes. So like 80% of their day is thought about food, and what they're consuming, and like, is this clean enough? Does it have any ingredients that I think might cause cancer? And so you're spending so much
my couch gonna kill me?
Exactly. Spending so much mental energy on those thought processes that it can literally take over your life.
As a coach, I definitely see athletes being nervous. Like, they'll say things to me like, oh, I need to get this junk out of my diet, or I need to clean up my act. And it scares me because I personally, anecdotally, much more see the negative impacts of underfueling versus, like, I don't know, like, could you eat one less corn dog? Maybe. But also, like, I would always rather have one corn dog between you and a stress injury than not, And it's just, again, like, the way that we perform our athletic identities at each other and in our community can really exacerbate these issues in a population that's already super at risk because of other comorbidities.
So if someone feels that anything we've talked about today resonates, what can they do?
First, I would say if you're curious about any of this and it's sort of challenging you, scaring you, if you're angry at us for this discussion and you think that we are not enough on board with clean eating, my 10 cents would be to reach out to a mental health professional. I think that's always a great place to start, just to assess like the severity of any potential eating disorder or disordered eating. I would also make sure that, on a personal level, that all food groups are represented in your diet and work on breaking down some of the ideas that you might have about what makes something healthy. Working with a dietitian like Kylie can help you make sure that you're adequately nourishing your body, fueling your athletics, all while helping you fight some of the misinformation that we all have inherited about food.
I just want to point out, too, that the mental health piece is really important. And I think, I love when people reach out to me and they want to work together and they maybe are already recognizing that they overthink their food choices. But at a certain point, I can help people fuel and change their mindset around food, but there's oftentimes underlying mental health challenges that need to be addressed or thought processes that need to be addressed by a professional. And I can't stress that enough, that like, if you truly want to get to a better place with this, I think having a team is one of the best approaches that you can take.
The eating disorder is never just about the food, and inherently the recovery process is never just about the food either. And I think something that's important for people is to embrace living in that gray zone. So instead of having like all or nothing or black or white thinking, good, bad, junk food, good food, learn to think in shades of gray. And that means accepting that all foods in moderation can be part of a balanced diet.
I think some people get annoyed at hearing that, that all foods fit or all foods in moderation. But it is really true. And I think this is where in the social media context, people hear that and it's like, oh, they're just being parroted that. and there's not room for a nuanced conversation, which is why I think there's a big problem with social media and the presentation of nutrition and food and all of those sorts of things. So listening to thoughtful conversations or talking with an expert that might be able to have those conversations with you might be a better option.
Yeah. And as we discussed in our cults episode and in the fasting episode, people actually crave clarity and rigidity. And it's not human nature to embrace concepts of balance, mindfulness, moderation, and thinking critically about things. And we're going to need all of those skills to dismantle orthorexic thinking and behaviors.
It depends.
I think another good thing is to focus on how food makes you feel. Give yourself permission to eat foods that you enjoy and make you feel good, and don't judge yourself. Eating and enjoying food can be really pleasurable. Pleasure is okay. Pleasure isn't a moral failing. Eating isn't cheating, right? Try to tap into intuitive eating practices where those feel good to you, with an understanding that for athletes, there can be limitations to that specific approach.
I think it's great to take an intuitive eating approach. And I think also being intentional with what you're doing. So kind of marrying those two things together to fuel yourself can be really helpful. And then understanding, to go off of this, that food is more than just fuel.
Yeah.
We can go and have a social interaction with our friends and do that with food. And we just had a lovely pizza party last night and it was amazing.
We did. We're still high off an amazing group pizza party.
Yeah. And it was such an amazing experience. The food was great, but also the people made the experience. So just keeping that in mind.
And the fact, like, we felt so connected. We were gathered around a pizza oven, and it was such an amazing shared experience of a food that some people, it might not fit in their belief system. And I personally would be challenged by any belief system that doesn't have ample room for pizza.
Oh, pizza is life.
So I think another good thing is to challenge your food morality views. Identify the foods that carry morality for you and ask yourself questions like, who or what is the source of this label? Like, who said this is actually bad? What happens if I eat good or bad food? How would letting go of these moral labels potentially change my relationship with food? This might be really hard to unpack, especially if you have an eating disorder, disordered eating. So this is a great place to consider talking about these things in therapy or with a mental health professional.
Yes, again, that combo team too. And I think sometimes I've had therapists tell me that they really value having the dietitian there to kind of help guide on the food side of things so that we can talk through and kind of collaborate as a team. So yeah, get your help from professionals.
Get holistic with people
Exactly.
who have more than certifications. I think another good thing to do is to challenge one food label at a time. So for a lot of us, it's really hard to separate the labels from the food. So to make the task more manageable, start by challenging one label at a time. The more you practice, the easier it will become. I think a great word to start with is clean, or even cheat, or whatever word maybe is the most charged for you. Investigate that. Notice where it comes up and where it might be useful to strip it away.
And you can journal about it too. I'll have people, that are doing food challenges and they will include a certain food and they're like, oh, well, all I need to do is include this food. And so I'll include it and everything will get better. And I usually encourage them to go a little bit deeper than that, have the food and then journal about it, and then can kind of take the next steps to address those underlying thoughts around that food.
Yeah. Another, I think the last sort of key I would point to is to replace emotionally loaded words. Again, we saw in the research that moralizing and emotionally heavy words literally shape how we perceive of and experience these foods, and using more neutral terms can be really, really helpful. So when you find yourself passing judgment on food, replace morality terms with neutral language. For example, if you label pizza as junk, think of a neutral descriptive term that could be useful instead. Use words like cheesy or crispy. Focus on food as fuel. So it might be helpful to think of food in terms of the amount of fuel it provides. And starting from a neutral place, I think, can be really, really helpful.
Yeah, and then maybe unfollow sports nutrition companies that are not using neutral terms.
Again, like, these people aren't stupid. They know how this stuff works. And the fact that they intentionally choose to leverage pseudoscientific messaging, I think that should likely inform your consumer choices. Thanks for listening to Your Diet Sucks. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to share your favorite episode with a friend or on social media. Your Diet Sucks is hosted and researched by Kylie Van Horn and me, Zoe Rome. Sound and production also by me. thanks to Cleo Rome for the amazing original artwork for each episode. Also, special shout out to the excellent voice work by my friend Ryan Honey. Fuck yeah!